welcome to our guests. Welcome back to work, committee members. Those of you in the back who would like to have conversations, I encourage you to do that outside this room, especially the member for Winnipeg North. Welcome back. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082, briefing on automated teller machine fees and electronic payments, I welcome our witnesses today. Thank you very much for your submissions earlier to the committee. You have been told that you'll have 5 minutes, and I want to make it clear to you that I will have to hold you to that. I will give you an indication if you wish to make eye contact that you have a minute remaining or less, and then we'll unceremoniously cut you off to allow for exchange with committee members. Yeah. So I welcome you, and again, thank you. We'll begin with Nadia Massoud, Assistant Professor, Finance and Economics, University of Alberta. Nadia, you have 5 minutes.
All right. I want to indicate from the beginning, I am here without any agenda. I'm just expressing my views in terms of research. I started my interest in this area of research based on a personal experience. I was a PhD student at Queen's, moved from Waterloo, and when I was on Queen's campus, I couldn't find an ATM machine for Royal Bank, my bank. And the only ATM machine was available for me, TD, around the building. So after paying the fee a few times, I decided, you know, I'm going to avoid this. And I switched from Royal Bank to TD. And then I sat back. I said, what is the issue? Why banks tend to do this? So I picked my thesis, and I wrote 3 papers published in top journals, A journals. And basically what I looked at the following. I looked at banking competition on 2 fronts. The first one, which is basically the provision of the general banking services like credit cards, ATM machines, mortgages, and all different services. And the second one is just the ATM service. So, and then after this, it is perfectly, it's competitive environment. And then what I found actually banks in competitive environment, they provide ATM surcharge higher than the marginal cost. This is the first finding. The second finding, banks usually subsidize their members. The price can go even to 0. Possible solution is to go to 0. And the third finding, banks over-provide the ATM network. And then what I looked at, I collected data from US data, and I tested those findings empirically, and I found support for those results. What I found from my empirical testing, that banks that charge higher fees, they manage to increase their market share. And also, I found that this is a proof of switching, okay? And also what I found smaller banks, if they increase their ATM surcharge, they don't manage to increase their market share. The economic explanation behind these findings is the following. Banks set the ATM fee based on 2 factors. The first factor, based on the direct impact of the revenue generation from the ATM service. Okay? The second impact is the expectation of the consumer behavior. If I expect the consumer to change his behavior, then I should increase the ATM surcharge. And what we found, the indirect impact has a stronger effect than the direct impact. And this is all driven based on competition, but the main competition is not the provision of ATM service, it is the provision of the general services like the bank account, mortgages, and many other services if you choose to be a member with that bank. And in addition, one of my studies, it's to look at the US experience with the ATM surcharge. In the US, what happened in '96, the ban from Interact Plus removed, and banks were allowed to surcharge. Immediately, the year after, more than 50% of banks start to surcharge the ATM fee. And by year 2001, 90% of those banks start to charge. okay? And consumer activists start to look at this issue, and they said, this is we're talking about 98, 99. They said this is anti-competitive, anti-consumer, and it hurts more smaller bank in comparison to larger bank. And then they start to look at those issues. And some community, actually, they took action, and they backed initiative to ban the surcharge, like Santa Monica and community of San Francisco. And they took the case to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court decision in May 2003 basically ruled against the ban. So we look at the U.S. experience. It has been going for, like, in the past 10 years. Our reaction a little bit late came just recently. And my view is the following: it is competitive. And I'm not supporting bank. This is based on economics theory. And also I looked based on, this is not research, but I looked at empirical regularity. I looked at, for example, comparison with UK. So UK, they don't surcharge for using different ATM machines. But the UK, it's not banned. It's, yeah.
We will continue now.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We will continue, but before we continue with the witnesses,
we have two very important tasks this morning. The first is a vote in the House of Commons, and we also have to elect a new Vice Chair of the Finance Committee.
Elizabeth Kingston to take over at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On va procéder à la nomination du...
We're going to proceed with the nomination of the second Vice Chair.
Monsieur
Moi, je proposerais Paul Crête.
I would move that Paul Crête be Vice Chair.
Any other? Is it the pleasure of the committee to adopt the motion that Paul Crête be nominated second Vice Chair of the Standing Committee on Finance?
Petit discours, Monsieur.
A short speech, Mr. Crête, perhaps. Well, I'll simply say that I hope you'll always be just as glad to have me take the floor in the future.
This morning, on behalf of the Canadian Community Reinvestment Coalition, Mr. Conacher, you'll have 5 minutes. I'll just give you an indication when you have a minute remaining, so as not to hopefully have to cut you off without your knowing. Okay. Please proceed. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and committee members, for this opportunity to present on this important topic, which may seem like small change to some people, and certainly the banks try to make everybody think that it's just about small change. But it's actually a very important issue of not only consumer protection, but bank accountability. Et merci au comité pour...
And thanks to the committee for your invitation today to make this presentation.
I'm here representing the Canadian Community Reinvestment Coalition, which since early 1997 has been a force for increased bank accountability, consumer protection, community economic development, and the bank's role in service lending and investment across Canada. The coalition is made up of 100 citizen groups from across Canada in the areas of anti-poverty, community economic development, consumer, labor, youth, and women's groups, representing a total membership of more than 3 million Canadians. The coalition has seen through the last round of Bank Act changes, Bill C-8, some of its recommendations implemented. About 75% of its recommendations were implemented, but unfortunately key gaps were left in every single area, including the area of service fees. And as a result, the banks are still allowed to do pretty much whatever they want with Canadians' money and charge them whatever prices they want. You have seen Mr. Raymond Proddy in his swan song presentation as head of the Canadian Bankers Association present on March 26th these two documents to you. And the problem with these documents is while they provide lots of information, they withhold the key piece of information, a couple of key pieces of information that are needed to determine whether the bank's prices are fair. First of all, they withhold the key information of what it costs them to provide each service and product. And without the costs, you can't figure out what their profit margins are, and if you can't figure out their profit margins, you can't determine whether they're gouging. Secondly, they withhold the savings that they have realized from withdrawing full-service banking by shutting down branches and firing thousands of staff in the past 15 years. And so, as a result, we don't know on the savings side for them how much that withdrawal of full-service banking has saved them and allowed them to become even more profitable. Essentially, the federal government in the past 15 years has continued to allow gouging of all customers, but at the same time has allowed a two-tier banking system to be created, where wealthy people receive full-service banking in branches and less wealthy people are pushed to use bank machines or gouging cash-checking companies. I'm just going to examine all of the bank's arguments that are presented in these two documents briefly. They can be easily summarized. There's lots of pages here, but actually mostly half-truths and many irrelevant claims. First of all, the banks claim their fees are fair. Again, this can only be proven if the banks disclose revenues and costs so that profit margin can be determined. The banks are refusing to disclose their exact revenues and costs, even though they have admitted in these documents that they know exactly their costs. And they do not cross-subsidize the costs of any division of their operations, so they must know their costs. The banks claim they only charge a so-called convenience fee to use another bank's machine or non-owned bank machine. In fact, the banks doubled the cost of using another bank's machine. They used to charge just the Interact fee. They added the convenience fee post-2000. They've doubled the cost. And so even if the convenience fee was eliminated, they would still be receiving revenue from the Interact fee. The banks claim fees are comparable to other countries. In fact, fees in 8 countries, according to their own documents, are lower overall, including in the Netherlands at 66% lower. And the banks in the Netherlands also have a much lower interest spread. So as a result, they've been able to figure out how to have lower fees and a lower interest spread and still be profitable. The banks claim non-bank-owned machines are competitors. In fact, such machines are partners with the banks, not competitors, as they only facilitate customers accessing their bank account. And the banks save money because they pay no operating costs for these machines. The banks claim they are serving Canadians well. In fact, they've shut down full-service branches across the country. And they claim competition will work, so regulation is not needed. Regulation is definitely needed, because if competition worked, at least one of the banks would have lowered or cut the so-called convenience fee in the past 6 years, and none of them have. The overall solution...
Mr. Conacher, to cut you off, because we will have time for exchange with committee members, but your time's up.
If I could just say one other sentence. The overall solution is an audit of looking at what happened the past 15 years and annually in the future. If that audit's not done, nothing will protect consumers that you will recommend, and nothing will hold the banks accountable, and the gouging will continue.
Thank you, sir. We'll continue with the Canadian Consumer Initiative. John Lawford, counsel, is here. Mr. Lawford, 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm here today to present the position of 5 of the 6 members of the Canadian Consumer Initiative on bank fees. We're also here to present the views of the Canadian Consumer Initiative as a whole on electronic payments. I don't believe I'll have time to address our electronic payment submission. Suffice it to say that we were here in February and that we were making the same submission. We've noticed that something odd has been happening with over the last decade with automated banking machines and fees. While there are more ABMs and more competition, prices have increased and service has decreased. Canadian consumers are calling on elected representatives to help them out of this obviously dysfunctional market. Consumers are irked or annoyed, as the Prime Minister might say, with bank fees in general and convenience fees in particular. The issue goes beyond fees, however, and what may well be at stake is the sustenance of competition in the automated banking machine market. Economists recognize that convenience fees are first and foremost an anti-competitive weapon in the hands of network participants that wish to preserve their market share. It's therefore crucial for your committee to look in depth at the ramifications of the issue of convenience fees. Bank income from service charges has been growing fairly steadily over the last decade and the last 5 years. They now top $4.6 billion for the 6 largest banks. In the same period, banks have eliminated 25% of their branch network, mostly in rural and low-income neighborhoods. They've reduced the number of their own banking machines in the past 5 years and now own less than a third of ABMs deployed in Canada. Most have exited the market for point-of-sale payment as well. Banks therefore invest less in equipment, less tellers to transactions, and yet increase the income from new charges and fees. It should come as no surprise that consumers are angry and they do not feel they are sharing adequately increased cost efficiencies enjoyed by the banks. The Canadian ABM market was completely transformed by the consent order of the Competition Tribunal in 1996. This order allows providers other than financial institutions to enter the market for installed shared ABMs. There are now more than 100 that have done so, operating 35,000 ABMs. Yet the number of shared ABM transactions has been steadily declining since 2000. The unavoidable result of fewer transactions in a market served by more ABMs is that the number of transactions per ABM has dropped significantly. In time, the profitability of operating ABMs may become an issue for the non-bank operators, especially if market forces prompt consumers to prefer using their own bank's ABMs rather than other providers' machines. This is exactly the effect that convenience fees tend to have. They are done so that banks can make their own customers loyal and deter them from using other banks' equipment. Economists call this effect the substitution effect. If a customer from Bank A can keep using Bank A's ABM that he finds convenient while switching to Bank B as a customer, Bank A loses. The development of ING Bank is an example of what can happen. Customers switch from a Big Six bank to ING to enjoy better rates and keep using their old bank's ABMs. Convenience fees are designed to act as a counterweight to this substitution effect. What this means is that for banks, convenience fees are not merely an opportunity for windfall profits. They are a strategic weapon to retain customers in a market where competitors of all types are multiplying. It should therefore come as no surprise that they have not taken well to the notion of waiving convenience fees. While banks may see a benefit in convenience fees, however, non-financial institution ABM providers may be slowly getting strangled, as consumers would rather find one which is from their own institution than pay convenience fees. In such a scenario, competition may be drastically reduced, and in fact, the very reason for a shared ABM network may be threatened, as investments dwindle and the network's usefulness becomes lost on consumers. Therefore, in order to ensure the network's survival, convenience fees should be dropped. It is unclear, however, that the non-financial institution providers can currently survive without such income, and financial institutions are unlikely to agree to it. On the other hand, decreasing the number of shared transactions may push non-financial providers to increase fees in order to maintain revenue, in effect hastening their own demise as customers flock to cheaper means of payment. Next steps. The issue of convenience fees must be understood in a more global context. Canadian consumers wish for an inexpensive, viable, shared ABM network to be maintained, as they experienced for the most part before the banks started introducing convenience fees. Therefore, we have 4 recommendations for this committee. First, your committee should require that banks provide and put on the public record accurate data regarding the costs associated with providing deposit and retail payment services to Canadian consumers, total income with such operations, and net income derived therefrom, and the appropriate breakdown of data needed to understand specific aspects of ABM fees. Second,
we do have, however, your recommendations in your written submission, as you know, and I know the committee members have familiarized themselves with those. We'll continue with my fellow Manitoban, Andrew Douglas, who is here on behalf of Supporting Employment and Economic Development, Winnipeg Incorporated. Welcome, sir. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to address this committee on behalf of the Alternative Financial Service Coalition in the North End of Winnipeg. The North End is an inner-city community, one of the poorest in Canada. And although community members face many barriers and challenges, the people of the North End are also strong, resourceful, and carry within them a strong sense of social justice. Over the past decade, the Alternative Financial Services Coalition has been working with community members to develop financial services that increase opportunities and improve economic well-being. This work has an emphasis on cooperation, education, self-reliance, and social dignity. I'd like to talk to you about how fees incurred by low-income individuals when accessing their own money from ATMs has negative effects on families and communities. Before leaving Winnipeg, I stopped by my credit union to withdraw cash. I only withdrew enough to pay for the cab ride to and from the airport. For the rest of my expenses, I was fairly confident that I could use my debit card. I knew, though, that any withdrawals made from an ATM in Ottawa would carry extra fees because my credit union does not have any branches in Ontario. But this is not the experience of most people in Winnipeg's North End. Today, in order to speak with you, I've chosen to travel some distance from my credit union. The ATM fees I would need to pay in Ottawa would be because I left my community. Today, in the North End, in other low-income communities in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and Canada, many individuals and families are paying those same ATM fees not because they left their financial institutions, but because their financial institutions left them. In the past, there were mainstream banks on most major intersections, but those branches closed. Sometimes the banks left an ATM. In many cases, the branches sat vacant. But they're not vacant any longer. Now payday lenders, check cashers, and other fringe financial institutions occupy those buildings. White label ATMs are sometimes the only access individuals have to their money. So they're left with some unattractive choices. They can travel by bus for miles, often with children and strollers, to the nearest bank branch. They can use the nearest ATM, which may not belong to their financial institution and will involve extra fees. Or they can give up on having a bank account and settle for the unfair charges and fees of the many neighborhood check cashers. Low-income families should not be forced to make a choice between the lesser of three evils. Communities like Winnipeg's North End are still, for the most part, operating in cash. When individuals are withdrawing cash from an ATM, it's generally in smaller amounts, $20 here and $20 there. With smaller separate withdrawals, ATM fees account for a much larger percentage of the withdrawal amount. Some could argue there's an easy solution: make withdrawals of larger amounts and make fewer of them. But encouraging this would be discouraging the act of saving and increasing the risk of robbery and assault. For many Canadians, easy access to our money through bank branches and ATMs, anywhere at any time, is a basic convenience. For low-income communities, however, white label ATMs are often all that's left. And having to pay a high fee to access their own savings is simply a harsh reminder of what was lost when banks abandoned their neighborhoods. But there are opportunities to turn things around. Like in the North End, where community members, the Alternative Financial Services Coalition, and community-based financial institutions like Assiniboine Credit Union are testing a model of providing financial services that are affordable, accessible, and appropriate to the unique financial needs of the community, including financial literacy, special accounts, and microloans. But for now, that will only help some of the people in one of Winnipeg's low-income neighborhoods. We need you to address this issue for all low-income Canadians. ATM fees should not be a barrier between families and their savings. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Douglas, and good for you for ignoring those distracting bells. To committee members, we will continue with another presentation, and I believe we'll have significant time, perhaps even for two more presentations. We'll continue with Mark O'Connell now. Mr. O'Connell is the President and CEO of Interact Association, and I welcome you. 5 minutes to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and honourable members. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to tell you about Interact Association. In a private, not-for-profit association, our 80-plus members have cooperated to build a national payment network that allows Canadians to access their money at any time from just about anywhere in Canada. It offers two shared electronic financial services to Canadian consumers: Interact Shared Cash Dispensing at automated banking machines, and Interact Direct Payment at the point of sale. Shared cash dispensing allows cardholders to make cash withdrawals from ABMs not belonging to their own financial institution. Interac Direct Payment is Canada's national debit service, allowing consumers to make purchases using their debit card at more than 400,000 merchant locations from coast to coast. Through the success of these Interac services, Canadians enjoy a standard of banking convenience that is virtually unmatched around the world. Our membership at Interac includes banks, credit unions, trust companies, payment processors, terminal deployers, and merchants. These members compete vigorously with one another in the provision of Interac services to Canadian consumers and merchants. The members built the systems that enable the network to continuously operate in a 7/24 environment. We built and maintain the equipment that links the systems together. In addition, Interac sets and enforces the payment rules that govern the transactions over the network. We provide common marketing activities and provide security support for our members. Security support includes initiatives such as the fraud alert system and support of the migration of systems to chip technology to combat debit card fraud and to protect cardholders. Interac Association does not set or regulate fees charged by our members to consumers or merchants. In fact, as an association of competitors, we are expressly prohibited under competition law from setting or influencing this marketplace pricing. We are, however, committed to full and fair fee disclosure for consumers. Our regulations require ABM operators to display their fees, providing the consumer an opportunity to cancel a transaction if they do not wish to pay the fee. Interac Association does have a role in setting service pricing between our members. We set an interchange fee of 75 cents, which is paid by the customer's financial institution to the ABM operator. This fee is designed to partially compensate the ABM operator for the service of providing cash to the financial institution's customer. Canada's ABM marketplace is vibrantly competitive. The result is convenience and choice for Canadian consumers. In 1996, the Competition Bureau required our founding members to liberalize access to the Interac services and remove the existing prohibition against surcharges. This enabled ABM operators to charge fees directly to consumers, encouraging new competition and promoting expanded ABM deployment. That gave birth to the white label industry. Since then, the number of ABMs in Canada has more than tripled, from 18,000 bank-owned ABMs to roughly 55,000 ABMs today. Non-financial institutions now own and operate greater than 60% of these ABMs. Today, Canadians indeed have vast choice, and that choice is a direct result of the introduction of fees and the liberalization of the ABM marketplace. Consumers' choices for access to cash also include many low or no-cost alternatives. For example, most consumers do not pay a fee when withdrawing cash made at their own financial institution's ABM or in branch. In fact, roughly 75% of ABM cash withdrawals are made by customers using their own banks at no additional charge. Furthermore, we have seen a precipitous decline in the use of Interac shared cash dispensing, as many consumers are opting for lower-cost ways of accessing their cash, such as cash back at the merchant and Interac Direct Payment itself. 65% of Interac Direct Payment customers say they have used the cashback option this year, up from 54% in 2000. So in summary, Interac Association is a not-for-profit organization made up of diverse membership that competes vigorously with one another to provide their customers with 24/7 access to their money. The diversity of the parties and the competitive marketplace enables consumers to enjoy a standard of banking convenience that is virtually unmatched around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. O'Connell. We'll continue with Jerry Buckland, who is here on behalf of Menno Simons College. Welcome to you, sir, and 5 minutes is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson and committee members. Just a little bit of background about my research. I've been studying the phenomenon of financial exclusion, initially looking at Winnipeg's North End, as Andrew Douglas has already referred to, and recently I'm in the first year of a 3-year study looking at financial exclusion in 3 inner cities in Toronto, Winnipeg, and Vancouver with funding from SHIRK. I co-authored a report looking at some macro statistics regarding financial exclusion and submitted that as a brief. And what I wanted to do now was just to provide one point of context, which I thought I could contribute, and then refer to the ATM fee question. I noticed in your March 22nd meeting that there was reference to particular groups that face specific challenges in regards to financial services. And I'd like to pick up on a particular group that I think faces this challenge, and that is low-income people. One way to think about the financial service sector, in my mind, is to think about it as having a supply and a demand side. And for low-income people, on the demand side, I think there's evidence that things have worsened for them. In the 1990s, there's evidence that incomes of low-income Canadians have stagnated and that wealth and income inequality has grown. What this means is that increasing numbers of people, and to an increasing extent, I think people have fewer incentives to becoming banked. With the limited data available, I estimate that roughly 5% of Canadian adults are unbanked, and up to 10% in addition are underbanked. That is, they have a bank account but hardly use it. And possibly up to 16% of low-income Canadians are unbanked. On the supply side of the question, I think there's already been reference to a sort of 2-tier market in the financial sector, and I think there's evidence of that in many inner cities. And by that I mean the main tier is controlled by banks and other service providers, while the second tier is controlled by fringe banks, pawn shops, payday lenders, rent-to-owns, etc. And these fringe banks are particularly focused on low-income Canadians. So, for instance, in Winnipeg, I found that from the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada's data set on bank branch closures for 2002 to 2005, the majority of branch closures in Winnipeg occurred in low-income neighborhoods, and that's referenced in my brief. On the other hand, fringe banks are seeing great opportunities to make profits in inner-city neighborhoods. So again, for instance, in Winnipeg's North End, in 1980 there were 20 branch bank and credit union branches and only 1 pawn shop. By 2003, there were a reverse had happened. There were 5 bank and credit union branches and 18 fringe banks. So how does this segmentation of banking affect a growing number of low-income Canadians? And this relates to my final point regarding ATM fees. In the studies I've conducted, I've found that most low-income people, I would argue like most people generally, behave rationally. And that is, they choose financial services based on various costs and benefits that they see. The 3 costs that I wanted to pick up on are the explicit costs or fees that one faces. So, for instance, the ABM fee, the interbank fee, and the white label ATM fee is the cost that we're talking about the most here. But for many low-income Canadians, that's one of many costs they face. There's implicit economic costs that low-income people face. For instance, bank branches have been shutting down in low-income neighborhoods. They don't have telephones, they don't have internet, therefore they have to travel further. The costs to them are going to be greater. So there's more implicit economic costs they face. There's additionally implicit social costs that low-income consumers face in terms of accessing banks. And we've heard this again and again, low-income people going into banks and feeling that they don't get a level of respect that they would in other places. In fact, in some cases, fringe banks, people feel that they receive more respect. So there's social costs, I think, associated. For many low-income people, the implicit economic and social costs of using banks are heavy, and ATM fees add one more cost. For instance, for many low-income Canadians, white label ATMs are not convenient. They are simply the only option they have. So to address the problem of financial exclusion, what I think is needed is to look at the supply side in a broad sense. And what's needed are more branches, more technologies, and more services for low-income people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. We'll continue with Jeremy Trigg, President of the Exchange Network. Welcome to you, and 5 minutes over to you.
Good morning, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to address the committee on this important issue of ATM surcharging. FIConnect Services is the operator of the exchange, and it's owned by a number of smaller Canadian financial institutions. It has two core principles for the exchange network, one of which is no surcharging, and the other of which is full functional access, including deposit taking, transfers, and balance inquiries. At this date, the scope of the network is 2,150 ATMs, and these are operated by 244 financial institutions with ATMs located in all provinces. Of the 244 financial institutions, all but 8 are credit unions, the balance being chartered banks. The network is seen to offer choice for smaller financial institutions and gives customers of these financial institutions locations to perform surcharge-free transactions. In terms of surcharging, I think it's very important for the committee to understand that there are 3 types of fees that change hands within the financial institution sector. There is interchange. This is paid by the card-issuing financial institution to the ATM owner, and in this light, I'm going to refer to it as a financial institution. There are service charges. These are paid by the card holder to their own card-issuing financial institution. And there are surcharges. These are paid by the card holder to the ATM owner, and again, in this light, I will refer to them as a financial institution. We must be careful not to look at surcharges in isolation, because it's important to understand what the implications may be if indeed surcharges are regulated. Fees that are generated by ATM owners, be they surcharges or interchange, go towards the covering of the operational costs of ATMs. Any reduction in surcharge revenue received by ATM owners may have 2 sets of unintended consequences. Financial institutions will either work together to increase interchange fees, those paid between the card-issuing financial institution and the ATM-owning financial institution, to compensate for lost revenue. And the card-issuing financial institution will simply pass this on to their cardholders, and therefore, instead of being surcharged, the consumer will be service charged to a greater degree. The other option available is that because the business case for ATMs, and we do have the greatest convenience in the world here in Canada, the cost of operating those, if we take away the income side of the picture, what will happen is a number of these locations will close down, and there will be reduced convenience for Canadian consumers. Now, the exchange's approach, and you may say, why am I saying this when I'm running a network that doesn't surcharge? Well, the exchange's approach is to mimic the large proprietary networks of the 5 big banks in the country. Our network's larger than the smallest of those and about half the size of the largest. Therefore, transactions made by exchange card holders at ATMs that display the exchange logo will go without surcharges. Having said this, every single one of our financial institutions also belongs to other networks. They all belong to Interac. Many of them belong to a credit union network known as Acculink, and internationally networks like Plus, Cirrus, and the exchange in the U.S. Transactions made by cardholders with symbols from those networks at ATMs with those network symbols will be processed under the operating rules of those networks, which may include surcharging. So a Royal Bank cardholder, for example, that is not a member of the exchange using an exchange ATM will be surcharged. Now, FIConnects believe that surcharging in general does discourage a wider use of ATMs and tend to push Canadians to using their own financial institution. This is an impression that the Canadian exchange spends a lot of time and effort trying to overcome because it's seen as the norm. Nevertheless, it is critical that it's realized that any reduction in surcharging is either going to result ultimately in higher service charges or reduced convenience for Canadian consumers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. We'll conclude our presentations with Mel Fruitman, who is here on behalf of the Consumers Association of Canada. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be extremely brief. We are pleased to have this opportunity to appear here today. The Consumers Association of Canada is a 60-year-old, independent, not-for-profit, volunteer-based organization, the national office in Ottawa and provincial territorial representatives in every province. Our mandate is to inform and educate consumers on marketplace issues, to advocate for consumers with government and industry, and work to solve marketplace problems in beneficial ways. In general, we favor a competitive marketplace with government intervention when it is clear that consumers are at risk or that there is a potential for consumers to be harmed. With respect to electronic banking, our major concerns relate to privacy and security. We also see dangers for consumers when they conduct interjurisdictional transactions where different laws may apply and enforcement of protective laws may not be feasible. Additionally, we seek assurances that those who cannot or who have difficulty functioning in an electronic environment will not be penalized. And since we already hear the bells ringing and we've heard from many others, we will stop at this point, and we would be pleased to assist the committee in any way we can by responding to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fruitman. We have, I'm told, approximately 7 minutes till the vote, so we've got time for 6 minutes of questions from Mr. Thibault. Please proceed.
Did you want to start with one question first? You had one question.
Yeah, I can't
share your time as you wish.
I just want to go to Natty Massoud. I didn't realize that we'd be asking questions, otherwise I would have been a little bit more pursued. But I thought you actually had a fairly interesting presentation. And, you know, you're basically, your argument is your surcharge is above marginal cost. And what we've been trying to struggle with, as has Mr. Conacher, is what's the cost? What's the cost of the system here? And do you have any information to share with the committee on that?
I was talking about a theory model, so it's not based on empirical data. The theory model, so it can be any marginal cost. And the theory model shows that the ATM surcharge will be higher. But I don't have empirical data on the actual cost because this information is not clearly revealed.
Okay. Robert?
Thank you. Again to Ms. Massoud. In your presentation, you ran out of time, but do you have one recommendation how this should be dealt with by the Government of Canada, what Parliament should be recommending?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. And my final recommendation, those prices are determined based on competition. Banks are competing, but the main competition is not the ATM service, the main competition on attracting customers to the bank. And I don't think the government should intervene. Just leave the market. We're in free market. Keep the free market to determine the prices.
Thank you. Well, I think that brings it to an interesting point. I think, as Mr. Trigg was speaking, I think there is no free lunch. If we're going to want the service out there and we want these point of sales, I don't think we necessarily want less. I don't think we want a lesser distribution. Maybe we want a better distribution in some instances. I live in a rural area that's well served, I think quite well served, a lot better served than we were as access to cash at any time than we were when we had to depend on banking hours. It's true that there is some cost, but the cost is less than what I had before. And for having immediate access, ATM machines, debit machines, credit card transaction for the small business, you have your guaranteed cash, you have your cash deposit in your account a lot better than you were getting with personal checks and some NSF checks and all the other problems that were there. If we're going to regulate, if we're going to legislate, the only thing I can think of that could solve some of the problems I'm hearing here today is saying that Canada Post should do it and that every Canada Post outlet should have a free ATM machine, but then again that would have some cost. I was listening to Mr. Douglas and hearing the changes that's been made with the credit unions and their attempts on that. I'm well served by credit unions, but I find that their fees and their service is much similar. There's no big difference between what they're providing and what the other providers are. A little less better than the white labels, but the white labels are generally where the others don't want the service. I was wondering, Mr. Douglas, what would you recommend? What is the recommendation that you would give us that would give cheaper or access to Canadians in all areas?
I guess the recommendation I would like considered would be recognizing the low-income communities where there were at one time many banks, and when thinking of the North End, when those banks left the area, they didn't actually leave an ATM. So even the customers who were now, were still Royal Bank customers or CIBC customers, they didn't have the ATM even to go to. So all that they did have was the white label ATM. And so I guess if there's a way to look at sort of an area, if there's not a mainstream financial institution within a certain area, is there a way to provide easy access for those individuals to to get their money? So it's the getting money out and also the putting the money in. Sort of when all folks are left with are the fringe
but that's the
financials.
point. Are you suggesting that the
Cutting a little tight on the vote. We'll give you a minute and a half when we come back. Quick housekeeping. And this is very important for everyone to note because I love my food. And that food back there is for the committee members and the staff. I see some of you salivating back there, but salivate elsewhere because that's not your food. Witnesses, you're welcome to join in partaking of the lunch that's available. We are going to recess until 12:30, whereupon we will recontinue with questioning to our witnesses. We are recessed.
Here during the last sequence of interventions from the witnesses, but I understand it's Monsieur Thibault. You have 2 minutes remaining, 2.5 minutes, 2 minutes, a minute and a half to 2 minutes. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, and thank you to the witnesses for waiting so patiently. And now we're going to be cut short again, I understand. My final question would be to Mr. Connell. One of the things that we do here repeatedly is the question on competition. That speaks to competition is the question of protected territory, whether it's university campuses, as we heard, or airports, or areas where there are lots of people who are pretty well forced to access the ATM machines in that locale. It can be very large populations, and where that territory is contracted off or auctioned off to one ATM operator. I don't know, and I don't believe there's any federal mechanism we could use in that instances in many cases, but the network certainly would have ways to do with the Interact network within their policies and guidelines. Would it not be possible to ensure that there is always competition within those protected territories rather than bargaining it out to one carrier?
Well, as you know, I think from the previous day's testimony, that is solely in the power of the institution merchant, whether it be an airport or university that controls that premises. So that is not controlled by the ABM operator. It's usually an RFP process that goes out, and many of them have strategies of wanting multiple ABMs within their premises, and you know, some negotiate more for a single provider. So I don't think we would have purview to that, given that it's you know, kind of a free market or merchant responsibility.
Okay, thank you. Merci, Monsieur Thibault. We're going to try and keep this to the 6 minutes. Monsieur Crate, then I have Ms. Oblonsky, and then we're going to try to get to Judy. Monsieur Crate.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci d'être.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here. This is my first question as the bloc finance critic. And of course, poverty is a crucial issue in our society, and it's intricately linked to this issue, and I think that one of the witnesses underscored this. So we need to ensure that people get genuine and real access on an equal footing to these services. Now, Mr. O'Connell, I'd like you to tell us how your Interact Association is financed. You said it is a non-profit organisation. You said that you get revenue, but there must be, in addition to profits, some sort of operational surpluses. Could you give us ballpark figures on this? Are your members the ones that reap the financial rewards at the end of the day?
That's correct. We're a not-for-profit association, so we only recoup our operating profits in any given year for the activities that we provide within the network. And those activities are, number one, as I said, we operate the systems that link the various members' systems together in the network. But we do not obviously have purview or operate the large systems that sit within our direct connector nodes. It's very important to understand the Interact network is a decentralized network, and the benefits of that, obviously no single point of failure, so it's virtually impossible for the network ever to go down for Canadians, and hence its reliability. And then we provide, as I said, all of the administration of the payment rules and policies and so forth, plus the marketing services and the varied security services. So we recoup those costs in charging a member fee per year. But for example, the interchange fee that I mentioned, that is in our guidelines and mandated, that flows from the cardholder's financial institution, or the issuer, if you will, and flows to the ABM operator or acquirer. You know, that is not collected by Interact. We merely recoup our costs from an operating basis for those 4 main services that we provide annually.
Et est-ce que vous avez le même type de...
Do you have the same sort of overall contact with what I would call these white label ATMs? These are independent private ATMs. Does Interact offer service to those providers, and do you have the same economic relationship with them?
Among our members, the white label providers, they do connect to us in various ways, but the same premise would apply in that we do not, the funds and the different costs, we do not partake in that.
Et est-ce que le frais additionnel qui réclame...
Now, these surcharges, when you're asked at the ATM, would you agree to pay $1.50 more or $1 more, and you can say yes or no? Is this $1.50 what makes these profits, and can you identify what amount of this total fee is used for the Interact service? So, as I said, is there a cost that needs to be offset that is paid by the consumer directly?
So again, because Interact's not involved with setting or regulating prices nor the economics of our members, I can't speak to the profit or fees that are levied by those members. We have no purview to that. So I can't comment on a marginal cost basis.
Okay. Question peut-être à M. Barklin ou M. Lawford.
Mr. Lawford. Now, if someone gets a Social Security check, let's say $600 a month, and they're in a region where there's no banking service available, and they have to use a white label ATM to get their money, for example, what total amount of their month's revenue will have to be used? Is that a clear question? Mr. Buckland, or Mr. Lawford?
Yeah, that's clear. And, well, if, for instance, a single person receiving social assistance in Manitoba was getting about $250, they would be then looking at a white label ATM fee plus their bank fee. It could amount to maybe $5 simply to do a transaction. I mean, it depends on exactly how they do that transaction. More likely, they'll go to a check casher, in which case they'll be looking at more like $7 to $10 to pay for that check cashing fee, and that's a pretty big chunk off the top of that limited income.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur.
Thank you, sir. Your time's run out.
We continue now with, we'll have one more round of questioning from Madame Oblonzi, and then apologize to our witnesses for this democratic disruption that's occurring today. But Madame Oblonzi, over to you now.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you for being here, and particularly we apologize, even though we couldn't do anything about it, with the rather disjointed nature of the hearings, and in fact, we weren't even quite sure whether we'd get to the hearings before the vote and all those good things. But today we're studying, according to the motion before the committee, electronic transfers, automatic banking machines, and especially choice and competition for consumers, which I think most of us feel is a good thing. And when we talk about regulating banking fees or regulating ATM fees, or even regulating where banks have to offer services, there's quite often what's called the law of unintended consequences. You know, it looks like you're helping somebody, but really the equal and opposite reaction can actually be to constrict the service, to bump up fees in other areas. By trying to do good here, you can actually cause harm in a number of other areas. So that's really what I want to focus on. For example, let's suppose that we force the banks to reduce ABM fees. Then let's suppose the banks say, well, if there's not much profit in it for us, why should we put up machines and maintain them and make this all available, thereby handing the market over to the white label machines, who actually charge more fees than the banks do. I mean, there's just a lot of these scenarios that bother me. I don't think any of us would disagree that we want to help people who have trouble accessing bank services, et cetera, but by trying to do that, are we actually driving the paradigm in other ways that are not as desirable as we had first thought? So I just like to have some commentary on that, because I think a responsible committee will want to look at what I call those unintended consequences. Do the witnesses here see that as an issue? I'll start with Mr. O'Connell and then Mr. Cran as well.
I do. I think that is an issue. I think the scenario you painted is a possibility. I think perhaps a greater possibility would be that the regulation of the bank side, the 32% side of this marketplace, would likely, one of the witnesses mentioned that consumers usually act rationally in a marketplace, would probably push the white label market entirely out of existence, because the consumers would be going to the low-cost provider. So we'd eliminate a vibrant industry in Canada. We could use history as our guide. I think we'd find ourselves back in 1996 with 18,000 ATMs across the entire country, and therefore reducing, again, an unintended consequence, reducing the access points that we have, and trying to say that the ATM fees branches are going to be springing up in all of the rural areas, I think is a little bit far-fetched. So we would have the consumer losing in less access points as we had in 1996. We'd have an entire industry wiped out. And by the way, that industry also shares a portion of its revenue with the sole proprietors that usually rent the space of that ATM. So there's an entire other industry that is benefiting from that white label industry that we can't forget as well. So I think you're right. You would have some unintended consequences, and I see it as a lose-lose scenario.
The Consumers Association has taken the view that this piece of the marketplace is working very well. We like it as it is. We don't want any changes. We see no reason to. When we came out with our position several months ago after Mr. Layton made his statement, we had 3,000 to 4,000 emails, 90% of which were supporting our view. There were a smattering who didn't think the system was very good, but mainly because they thought the banks were making a huge profit. The criticisms we got were not relative to the reality of what was happening. 75%, the fact that 75% of people are making their withdrawals at their own branches and not paying fees, I think is a very significant item. There's a little piece of misinformation this morning from one of my colleagues, I've forgotten which one here, who mentioned that you are charged fees by credit unions. It's my understanding that any credit union, if you belong to one, you get free access to your money at any one, no matter which province it's in. So, in effect here, what we have is a system that's working very well. If you don't want to take money out from a second bank's machine and pay $1.50 extra, you don't have to. Obviously, people are very well aware of that. If you don't like the banks, you can go to the credit unions. My organisation looks for choice. We also look to for consumers to help themselves where it's possible. And I haven't seen any real arguments that there's anything wrong with the system that we have operating now. So my advice to the committee is, why fix something if it's not broken?
Thank you, Mr. Cran. Thank you, Madam Ablonzi. We have about 2 minutes until the vote, so we will recess again and reconvene as soon as we possibly can following the vote.
time we're going to?
We're going right till welcome back, committee members. Other committee members will be floating in here as they get reorganized. But out of respect for the time of our witnesses, and because committee members can review, of course, the proceedings tomorrow in Hansard, we'll continue with testimony with questions now. I see the member, my colleague for Winnipeg North, has a lovely plate of fruit and salad there, but I think she'll defer for 6 minutes while she asks some questions. So we'll proceed now with Mademoiselle Lichelis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, and thank you to all the panelists for your patience as we go back and forth to the House for these votes. And I really appreciate the panel today. I think this is going to be very important as we sort through the whole issue of electronic banking and ATM fees. I also wanted to particularly thank Andrew Douglas and Jerry Buckland for coming today and giving some validity to what I have been harping at for many, many months, maybe years here at the committee and in the House, and I'm not sure everyone always believed me when I talked about a community as large as North End Winnipeg that has been abandoned by the banks, where we've seen 10 bank closures over the last decade, and where in fact the choices are payday lenders and other fringe financial institutions or private label ATMs basically. And we have two credit unions. We have one that is restricted in terms of membership. One is Polish and one is Ukrainian, one is open and one is closed. And that's it. And as a result, the community really fought back against all of these bank closures without success, except that we did get a little bit of money from the last bank closure from CIBC to help start a study into an alternative financial community services center. And that center is now up and running. And Andrew Douglas mentioned it. Jerry Buckland was instrumental in its formation. And it probably is the first of its kind in the country. And it's playing a vital role where the banks have failed us. And I wanted to say that, and I wanted Andrew and Jerry just to talk for a minute about this. You've heard now, you've sat through this whole notion that that we need choice and competition. That's the mantra of the government side. I think maybe the Liberals too, from what I've heard today, regardless of which people fall between the cracks. And you've heard a lot about unintended consequences and about, you know, if we do this, you know, reduce fees or put some pressure on the banks to change this or be more accountable, that there's going to be this huge falling out in terms of access for consumers. And yet no one of that group and others have talked about the unintended consequences of a system that has allowed for banks to shut down willy-nilly their branches, take away their ATMs, leave private label machines, which can mean a charge of up to $6.15 per transaction. And I think it's about time. We heard from some folks at this table who think it's okay to have this system, how they can explain and account for that kind of a charge, especially the Consumers Association of Canada, that claims to represent consumers, when that is happening in areas where, in fact, seniors and low-income people are taking out $20 or $30 out of a private label machine and charged up to $6.15. So let me start with Andrew and Jerry, and if time permits, I hope there's time, I could hear some accountability from the others on those questions.
Yes, thank you. I think when thinking of our goals in setting up this community financial services center, an answer that was put together with consultation with the community, it was finding ways of keeping as much money in the community's pockets as possible. So recognizing that lots of the family members in our area are receiving social assistance, employment and income assistance, to get that small check and then have to lose a good hunk of that through ATM fees or through check cashing fees, it just isn't good money management, and we didn't feel right putting folks in that kind of a position. So on the one hand, to train folks in money management and ways of saving their money, and on the other hand, not having the opportunity for them to practice that, just was not feeling right. So I think, before passing it over to Jerry, Mr. Buckland, would be that as Judy, sorry, as the
Nobody says Wassail-Chalice here. It's okay.
we feel that there is a responsibility of the financial institutions, and so as a committee here, it's looking at ways to have community reinvestment and to have that a formalized process where banks and credit unions have the choice of either sort of hopefully coming back to communities, making sure that the services are available, finding other ways to be a part of the community. Financial institutions don't operate in a vacuum. They were once a part of the community and should be once again.
Yeah, I think that in some ways we have seen unintended consequences of the way in which banks have performed in the last maybe 10 or 15 years, in that the consequences for inner city neighborhoods has been a withdrawal of the bank branches. And certainly in Winnipeg's North End, and I think in other inner cities across the country, you can see this. And fringe banks have moved in as a result. Now, the consequence for low-income consumers is high fees, limited services that are really dead-end services. You can't develop a savings scheme. You can't build a credit rating at a fringe bank. So I think the solutions are for banks, credit unions to work together to use these fantastic technologies that many middle-income people, I think many of us take for granted, and use those technologies to reach into those low-income neighborhoods.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Buckland. Your time is done. Mr. Cran, you alluded earlier to the revenue generated by banks. You addressed that issue just briefly or touched on it, but I'm curious as to what data you have or your organization has researched that would tell you that the fees derived by banks from their ATMs are in line with in any way with the cost of providing the service?
I don't think we're particularly interested in getting involved into that. What we're trying to do is to evaluate whether this $1.50 is a reasonable charge. When this came up, that's what we were looking at. We've kept our focus at that level. One day we'll probably do some research into the areas that some other people have brought up here, including what you're discussing there. At this point, we're not looking at that. We're saying that Canadians generally don't mind this $1.50.
Be clear on that, Mr. Cran. Then you're not suggesting the $1.50 charge that you've referenced is fair, justified, or right. You're simply referring to the fact that it's generally palatable among the Canadian public to have it in place. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. That is the...
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. We'll continue with Mr. McCallum now. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the patience of all the witnesses with 2 votes intervening. I guess my question is to do with what exactly people want the government to do. And I think my colleague asked a question or 2 on that, and I'm not sure he got a terribly clear answer. And I guess I'm a little bit with Diana Blonsky on this, which is a rare event, but it's a question of unintended consequences. As a simple matter of economics, it seems to me that if, for example, you ban fees on bank machines giving money to people from other banks, then there will be far fewer of those machines. And if there are far fewer of those machines, people will have to use the white label machines, which are now 60% plus of the market and cost a whole lot more. So I don't understand what the NDP is proposing or what others are proposing to do, because it seems to me that you could easily end up hurting the very people that you were trying to help. And I haven't heard a clear answer on that. And so I'd like Mr. Conacher, who wants to speak, to answer briefly, and then Mr. O'Connell, I think, would be a good intervener as well.
The lowering of one fee will just be replaced by the banks with adding a new fee or increasing other fees. The banks have said that, although the ones that spoke to the Globe and Mail did not want to be named, the bank officials that said that. As a result, the only solution is to regulate the banks as providers of essential banking services, and essential service as essential as heat and hydro and telephone for living in today's society. Regulate them as other essential banking, other essential service companies are regulated. And that is that you need to do an audit looking back over the past 15 years and annually in the future of the revenues the banks have received from each fee for each service and product, the costs the banks paid to provide each service and product.
I read your press release, but what do you want to come out of that? What action do you want to take?
And then you also need to look at the effects on competition, whether there actually is competition in many areas of the country for banking service providers that are providing services in the way that Canadians want to bank. And when you look at that, I think you will find monopolies and duopolies across the country for these essential services. You'll find the banks have saved hundreds of billions from withdrawing full-service banking. And then the government should require the banks to give something back finally, setting up machines, setting up full-service branches for access to basic banking services at least in many areas of the country where they've been shut down. And there will be no effect at all in terms of access or what is out there already, because you'll just simply be asking the banks to give back based on the savings and that they have realized and the costs they've imposed on the country.
Okay, but I still don't understand, and I'm now going to turn to Mr. O'Connell.
That's what they did in the U.S. 20 years ago.
I still don't really understand how, if the banks are required to have zero price on all these machines, they'll have any machines at all. But I'd like to ask Mr. O'Connell about this issue of unintended consequences.
And as I said before, I think what you will find, I think we must be careful. We're here to talk about the ABM industry and whether consumers are being adversely affected and whether this industry is competitive. My colleagues keep branching out into an overhaul of the banking system, whether in the rural areas or in the cities. So I'm going to try and keep it on point. And I think that I won't make assumptions as to what the banks will do, as Duff has done, as far as their fees, but I will say that I know the investment certainly will not go into a network if it is not cost effective, as Nadia's research has indicated. They will not be investing into that network. History is our guide, as I said. We will see a shrinkage of services in the ABM channel from the banks. And then, as I said, you have the other issue of the white label industry being wiped off the face of the marketplace as well, again, adversely affecting the consumer.
Maybe I could ask Professor Massoud for a dispassionate academic view on this subject.
Brief, dispassionate academic response.
Exactly. Actually, I investigated this point in particular, and my research was funded with Schulich School of Business. And I looked at the consequence of policy of banning ATM surcharge. And the consequence, the main result is the following: lower ATM density. The fee is higher for the bank members, so the fee switch from the foreign users of ATM to the own bank members. So it's not welfare improving, it's just a switching of behavior.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Madam and Mr. McCallum, we move now to Mr. Dykstra, 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a couple of questions. One is just actually just out of interest. Mr. Douglas, you mentioned the fact that you came here and once you left the confines of obviously your beautiful community, that you came here with the understanding that you would pay some ATM fees if you determined that you didn't want to take cash with you in your pocket. Your only choice in your community is a credit union. There is no other option. So that
in your
community, greater community, the only option, the only banking institution in your community is a credit union?
No.
I see. So you made the personal decision prior to coming to Ottawa that you would determine that the credit union would serve you better than the bank, than a commercial bank in your community.
Yes, when looking at all of the variables as far as
So perfect. That was actually going to lead into my next point. There are a number of variables that made you decide to deal with the credit union versus a commercial bank.
Right.
I would assume that those variables were benefits versus costs.
In some cases, the main one being the work that Assiniboine Credit Union does in communities like the North End of Winnipeg. I was willing to give up higher interest rates on savings for that return.
My only point is, and it's a bit of a, just that you raised it as a personal issue, I ask it in that fashion. Just so you knowingly made the decision to deal with the credit union versus dealing with the bank, and knowing full well that when you went outside, when you chose to go outside of your own community, that there would be, if you decided not to take cash with you, there would be decision, you would be paying an ATM fee. You did that in full knowledge.
That's correct.
Okay, yeah. Thanks. I just wanted to be clear on that. We had a couple of presentations leading up to the previous, I guess, time that we had, and Mr. Buckland, we had a fellow by the name of Michael Arnold, who's the executive director of a company that mentioned that government should be focused on regulating white label ATMs versus dealing with the banks on that. I wondered if based on your presentation, if you could comment on whether you agree or disagree with that statement.
Well, I see it's a real challenge that on the one hand, high fees mean that there are going to be more white label or other ATMs. But on the other hand, what I've seen in inner city neighborhoods is that the outcome is that low-income people end up paying much more for limited quality services as compared to non-low-income people. So I don't think it's a simple answer regarding like a fee cap on ATM fees. I think it goes back to this broader question of how do we promote financial inclusion and how do we boost the benefits and reduce the costs for low-income people to get into the banking system. And that has to do with setting up pilots like the Community Financial Service Centre in Winnipeg and Pigeon Park Savings in Vancouver and the Royal Bank's Cash and Save projects in Toronto. Setting up those kind of pilots are ways to kind of experiment and learn how are ways to bring low-income people back into the banking sector.
Yeah, we also had a presentation from Raymond Proddy, as the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Bankers Association. And perhaps, Mr. O'Connell, you could comment. I wouldn't mind actually if Mr. Cran, if time allows, if he could comment as well. One of the statements that he made, or suggestions that he made, was that ATMs have been great for Canada, and that the only issue that continues to arise is that when one user of one particular financial institution goes to another financial institution's ATM machine and is charged a fee, and that seems to be the issue that we continually are dealing with. Would you agree with that?
You're referring to the surcharge fee that
right. As long as you use your own banking institution, then you're not going to pay a fee, and that you go somewhere else and you are, and that seems to be the issue that we're dealing with.
Correct, and my belief, and as I said, I think the market is playing it out. That introduction of that fee introduced a business model which has led to more choice and convenience for Canadians across the country. And we can see that the way the industry exploded in 1996 to today.
Continuez avec Monsieur Saint-Cyr. 5 minutes, Monsieur.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question for Mr. Lawford. I looked at your brief, and in the recommendations at the end of your brief, you said that the committee should recommend that the Competition Bureau's powers be extended so that it can investigate the market operational issues, even if there is no violation of the law. I think this is a interesting recommendation. We made a recommendation with the Bloc Québécois with respect to oil companies in the past. Now, I'd like to recommend to you, and you have the opportunity to be at this parliamentary committee, to express your full opinion with no fear of any political or other reprisal. So you're doing it freely. is there any violation of the law currently occurring? And based on your recommendation, would you like the mandate to be broadened, even if it does not fit in exactly with the legislation? Well, we need to ask the banks to justify these fees. We have no statistics, useful statistics, indicating whether or not these fees are justified. Nobody knows how much it costs to provide the service at the ATMs, or how much it costs when services are provided from another financial institution. So perhaps the Competition Bureau should have these powers extended to it. We could debate that possibility, but unfortunately we don't have any data to speak of today. And if we have a government that takes the lead, that would help. I'd like to continue on the issue of costs. Everyday Canadians and Quebecers who go into financial institutions and conduct transactions, well, they have trouble understanding the link between the price and the service which is provided to them. So, to my mind, and this is how I conceive this issue, I'm not a specialist, but it would seem that most transactions and most of the costs associated with ATMs are set fees. For example, purchasing of computer software, rent, all those sorts of costs. But if I have 10 transactions per day or 10,000 transactions, aside from putting in coins into the machine itself, I don't understand how these costs fluctuate. Now, explain to me if I'm wrong here. Now, why should there be more transaction fees charged of someone who might make 7 withdrawals of $20 per week rather than someone who decides to withdraw $140 a week in one fell swoop, even though it would cost the bank exactly the same amount, whether it's 7 lots of $20 or 1 lot of $140? Mr. O'Connell perhaps could answer.
So is your question specifically, are the costs all fixed?
Mostly
versus
fixed.
Variable? Again, I can speak to, the costs that Interac has auspices or purview to. And in my previous life, coming from a technology company that provides outsourced services, certainly, no, there are a number of those itinerant costs are data processing costs. Every time you ask a message through the network, the telecommunications infrastructure, every time you hit a switch, or go through a different element in the network chain, there is a cost associated with that. So, but again, I can't get into the details of the my specific members' costs because I have no purview to
Mais
them.
à ce moment-là, seulement pour votre service,
I'm just talking about your service. What are the set infrastructure costs for your services, and what proportion of these costs are in relation to the quantity of transactions conducted?
Okay, so let's go. As I mentioned, our services are to interconnect the various nodes that sit on the network. 14 direct connectors sit on the network. They are responsible for having a physical link with every other direct connector, so there's no point of failure. Interac is responsible only for the infrastructure and the telecommunications network to connect those nodes. As well as some fraud systems and some monitoring systems. So you would be correct in that our limited responsibility from an information technology perspective is somewhat fixed. But we are not involved in the data processing end the switching end. That's our member systems, whether they be acquirers or issuers or financial institutions.
Donc, la majorité...
Beaucoup, monsieur.
Thank you, sir.
Just a couple of questions. Mr. Lawford, and I think also Mr. Conacher, in your written briefs, you allude to the importance of some fee structure, or the need for some fee structure to be in place for the banks to protect their own clientele, in essence as a kind of a firewall, for lack of a better word, that would safeguard their own clientele against the intrusion or against the reality of the marketplace, which would essentially be that if you could freely access your bank's account from any other machine, then why not access ING Direct from your bank's machine too, sort of thing. Can you elaborate a little bit, Mr. Lawford, on that point and explain, if that's the case, how one could then argue for a kind of a utopian situation where there wouldn't be fees? Wouldn't you be asking an industry that we would like to have be more competitive to be less so?
If I may, the banks have made that utopia already. It's called Interac, or the exchange. Mm-hmm. And they decided to have a network because customers demanded having a network where they could take money out from other machines, other banks. The value of the network to consumers grows as the network grows. So the costs that are being put on now with fees where you take money out from the wrong bank machine, if I may put it that way, are simply there, we believe, to keep you loyal to your own bank so that you won't go with ING, yet use the Royal Bank, for example's bank machines because there are more of them closer to you, for example. That's the reason for those fees. We've seen no justification from the banks on how much these costs. The marginal cost, it looks like, for actually doing that sort of transaction at the wrong bank machine is probably very low. It's probably a lot less than $1.50, and Canadians are fed up with that. We haven't seen what the costs are because no one will tell us. So that is the problem at the moment, and that's why we think these fees, the ones where you take money out from the wrong bank machine, are bothering people, and that's, we believe, why we're here today.
Okay. Before I go on to Mr. Conacher, then, what you're essentially saying, and I accept your point, and several have made it, about the advantages of being able to analyze with appropriate data the fairness of these fees as they pertain to the use of the network. But that being said, are you not then asking for the industry participants to disadvantage themselves in terms of their ability to retain clients, by the implication being the removal of a fee that would allow their clients to then access any of their competitors more effectively? Are you not, in essence, we wouldn't do this for any other industry in the country. We wouldn't say to marketers of, well, except in Western Canada with grain marketing currently, but that's another issue entirely. You wouldn't say to people in a competitive industry that they don't have the ability to run their business, in effect, to protect their own business. Isn't that what you're asking here?
The parallel can be drawn with telecommunications. We ask large telecommunications providers to allow competitors to connect to their networks. Mm-hmm. It's the same principle. The network is more valuable as it gets larger. Everyone joins into the network, and the benefits go to consumers. Yes, it is somewhat of an interference in a completely free market. However, the value is spread amongst more people, including consumers.
Okay, so then the question would be, where does that stop? Or does it stop? Are we then moving towards one big giant utility that offers all Canadian savings accounts with regulated rates and so on? Because what I've seen in my circumstances, as Mr. Thibault has alluded to in his, we have similar demographic factors at work in our ridings, is when banks have left, credit unions have moved in, and we have found better services from those and a combination of various ABM machines in communities that otherwise would not have banking services at all. If we try to regulate away the differences, are we not in danger of the perverse consequence of actually limiting the availability of that same service in certain parts of our country? And Mr. Conacher, I'll give you a chance to respond.
No, I don't believe that you're going to have that kind of flight but I'll let him answer.
Okay. Well, if you say you don't believe that, but
it goes against logic that you could regulate banks to be present in places they don't want to be, too. So I'll let Mr. Conacher respond.
The committee is missing two key pieces of information, and as a result, I don't think can make any recommendations that would actually solve any of the problems we're raising in reality. And those two key pieces of information are: what does it actually cost the banks to provide all of their services and products versus the revenue, fee revenue from each of those services and products? And secondly, what is actually the level of competition? There hasn't been a study since '98, and that was only a partial study by the Competition Bureau. I believe if you actually looked, you'd find there are actually monopolies and duopolies in a lot of areas. If you looked actually at a realistic definition of market and a realistic definition of how customers want to actually bank. A lot of people don't want to use telephone and internet, so you don't include those in. If they're not using them, it means they don't want them and they're not choices. Mm-hmm. That's how competition is defined, by what customers actually do, not what you want them to do or what the banks are trying to shove down their throats in terms of their agenda. If you had that information, then you could look at the situation and say, okay, in this area, in this market, that bank branch is actually a utility. It has a monopoly, and therefore we're going to regulate the prices. And in this area, there is no banking service. And in the U.S., what they do in those situations, and have for 20 years, is they look at the service lending investment patterns and the branch closure patterns, and they require banks to reopen branches or set up special programs, because they know and have known for more than 20 years something that, for some reason, most federal political parties and certainly the federal government doesn't seem to want to recognize. Banking is an essential service, and bank branches that serve communities are essential to the health of those communities in every single way in terms of the local economy, community development. And so without these two pieces of information, and this is what the committee should recommend, is we need a full study of is there actually competition in a local market study across the country, and an audit of the costs and the revenues and the profit margins for the banks. And we're not asking, as Mr. McCallum implied, for these fees to be eliminated to zero. No, just lowered to a reasonable profit level. If it costs the banks 10 cents for you to self-serve yourself, when you go to a gas station, you usually pay less. When you go to the banks, the price has doubled, and you pay more now to self-service bank than you do to use a teller. It's kind of bizarre, isn't it? You're pushing the buttons, and you pay more. And we're just asking them to be lowered to a reasonable profit margin level, which an average corporate profit margin would be 15 to 20%. So if it costs the banks 10 cents and they're charging $3, that's a bit more than 15 to 20% profit margin. If they can prove it costs them $2.50 and they're charging $3, then you're in the 15 to 20% profit margin range. The banks claim in these documents, the CBA says we do not cross-subsidize any costs from any part of our operations. Not one cost from any service or product or loan or credit instrument is cross-subsidizing another cost. So they know their costs exactly for every service and product. That's what they claim in these documents. They can't have it both ways. Require them to prove that their prices are fair, and if they can't, require them to lower the prices.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Wallace.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize to the presenters today that I was out defending my private member's bill before I got here, and then there was votes and so on. But I'm very familiar with the topic, and I appreciate the time you've put in here. And so I may ask a question or two that have been already answered, but I would like to know what the answer is. My friend from the New Democratic Party, and she's from a different type of riding than I am. I'm from Burlington, Ontario. We've got banks on every corner. I can tell you the building that my constituency office is in a Burlington Mall, and there's a bank machine, and 30 feet away is another white label machine. And we got banks and bank opportunities virtually everywhere in my riding. And I try to use my own bank, which will go unnamed, to try to reduce as many fees as I have to pay. But two of the issues that I want to be clear on for my constituents is that there was an indication that the banks actually own the white label companies. Or they finance lots of businesses, but they actually are the owners, and what they're doing is they're abandoning the marketplace so white label companies can take their place, charge more, and then eventually, through profits, the bank would make more. Is that an accurate statement? Maybe Mr. O'Connell can answer that. I don't know.
No, it is not, unequivocally.
So banks do not own the white label companies.
They do not.
Okay, so they are private sector. I think some of them had been trusts or income trusts, maybe even before too. But they are privately owned options. Are there those who are traded through shares? Do you know?
You have a mix. Most are medium-sized, privately owned companies. You also have companies. A member of ours, Open Solutions, which was publicly traded, I believe, and now has gone back private. But they are medium-sized, to the most part, Canadian businesses.
Okay. My next question. So that deals with that. The other question that has been brought forward, and I've experienced it myself as a municipal councillor with sole source RFPs, requests for proposals. And I had one, and I don't know where it is, from the airport in Victoria that we recently closed in the end of March. And it says directly in there that whoever bidding on this would have exclusive use of the facility. Now, isn't that not the operator of the facility that's making that decision, that's a sole source function of that RFP? Mr. O'Connell, can you maybe, your members probably bid on these things, so.
That as well is correct. That is fully under the control of the owner of the premises and the way they want to architect their RFP and architect their strategy for their premises.
I didn't see anything in there that said it had to be a bank, a credit union, or a white label company. Is that the norm on RFPs, that it's open for the complete competition to whoever's providing automated banking services? Or do some of them say it needs to be a bank, needs to be a credit union?
I wouldn't have purview to enough of the merchant-specific RFPs to answer definitively. I think if you look at, though, the market and you look at our members and where their machines are deployed, it seems to indicate that there is certainly open to full competition, because you have many of these premises with both types of devices.
Okay. My other concern is that, and I think, to be frank, that we've, as a government, have had success with the discussion on the ABM piece with the finance minister, and the discussion that's happened here at this table has driven some banks to make some changes in the recent days on some fees. Maybe not to this gentleman's satisfaction, but it has happened and will likely continue to happen. But from a competition point of view, correct me if I'm wrong, but credit unions have a deal with amongst themselves. They don't charge, like if I use credit union A and I belong to credit union B, it doesn't cost me anything to use that. Is that a competitive advantage for credit unions?
I think whether it's an advantage, it's a competitive reality, which is that credit unions are obviously significantly smaller than any of the 5 chartered banks. So by banding together and providing a larger scope of access, and they have 2 options. There's a network called AccuLink, which is credit union only, and then they could participate in the exchange, which other than the prairies, the rest of the country do. To allow for a no surcharge situation. And then some of the individual credit unions choose at their option not to charge any incremental service charges to their own cardholders for those transactions as well.
And they're doing that. Thank you for that answer. They're doing that to try to, because it is a competitive marketplace, and to attract customers. These are the types of programs that they're offering to potential customers to come and join their credit union. Is that an accurate statement? Yes. And has that been around for a while, or is that something new, or is that...
The exchange actually pre-exists AccuLink by 3 years, so it's been around since 1983, and AccuLink, to my recollection, has been around since 1996. So it's been in place for quite a long time, yes.
We'll continue with Madame Wazala-Chalice now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. First of all, I think the point that Duff and others have made about it being difficult for us to proceed in a serious way without accurate information is a good one, and we need to find a way to get that audit done. I should point out that a motion was presented to this committee during Bill C-37 to, after we lost the efforts to reduce and eliminate ATM fees, to at least get disclosure, full disclosure of costs and fees. That was defeated. That was defeated at this committee, thanks to the Liberals supporting the Conservatives. So we're at a real impasse here, just in terms of basic democracy and basic information. And you know, I don't know why there is this need to cover up. I don't know what we'll hear from the banks on Thursday, but this is where we're at. Now, in terms of the costs and the whole question about what's justified, I think the economists here and Mr. O'Connell and even Mr. Trigg should, and the Consumers Association, should answer the fact that the costs have been identified, perhaps not by the banks, but we had witnesses at this committee, and I'll just put on record Dr. Lou Johnson's figures of at maximum, a 60-cent per transaction cost to the financial institution. He rolls in about a 30-cent fee at the most in terms of a transaction for the bank involved. He says the interact fee or the switchback fee is 2 to 15 cents per transaction. You can add something for technology, add something for something else, and at most you are talking about a 60-cent fee cost per transaction. You know what that means? Consumers Association, over a 500 or 600% markup to consumers. That's acceptable to you? You say it's the way it is and you're just going to accept it. Well, I can tell you, you may hear from a certain number of constituents and people out there, but the vast number of Canadians are concerned that they're having to pay that kind of a markup and pay that kind of a cost when the banks are making the profits they are and exceeding their costs by 500 or 600%. How do you justify that? How do you justify that? How, Mr. O'Connell, do you not say anything in the face of that kind of situation? How is it that it's not reasonable at this committee to talk about a more reasonable fee structure? What is the problem here? What are you whose interests are you trying to protect? What is, you know, are the bank's interests that important?
Excuse me,
sorry,
Madam. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No.
Okay.
Yeah,
My time's up.
we're on. That's the 17th question you've asked, and
okay.
not with any time allowed for any answers. So
all right.
I would suggest you get a couple of minutes. It'd be good to hear from some expert witnesses on the issue. Perhaps a question to them would be useful.
Yes, I'd like to know from the Consumers Association how a 600% markup is allowed, and I'd like to know from Nadia Massoud if she, in all of her machinations or numbers, if she included the savings from all the banks, to all the banks by closing so many branches, eliminating physical infrastructure, and laying off personnel as part of the savings that they are generating as a result of going to ATMs.
Sorry. Well, Madam, you are going sort of, I think, well beyond the purview of what we are here to discuss.
Excuse me, on a point of order, Mr. Chairperson, we have a motion before this committee to study the broad issues of bank fees, ATM fees, and indirect and electronic banking. In fact, I'll point out to you, to Mr. Fruitman, that the motion before the committee is a result of my work, and it was there, in fact, to deal with a very important consumer issue. So, if you'd like to answer the question, a very specific one, please go ahead.
Thank you. First of all, I do not know whether the information you have presented is accurate. We would not disagree with a limited look at the financial institutions along the lines that Mr. Conacher has suggested, if indeed there is collusion, or if indeed there are markets in which there is no true competition, then those could be looked at. In terms of the actual profits of the financial institutions, unless or in the absence of proof of those two problems, I do not see that we're not asking to have regulated fees for an industry in a competitive and open marketplace in this country.
That's sworn testimony at 60 cents per transaction cost. So that's what I'm asking you. Are you saying you can justify, charge up to 465 cents?
No more so than we can justify what Walmart charges for any of the items in its store.
Oh, so you lump the banks in with Walmart. So we shouldn't have a bank act, and we shouldn't have any kind of regulations, and people shouldn't trust their governments to set a proper regulatory framework?
We'll continue now with Mr. Del Mastro.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know where to begin here. I'm afraid the temperature in the room is going to come down just a touch here on the next line of questioning. Mr. Fruitman, it would seem to me that what we have before us is a tremendous opportunity for the banks to respond in a fashion by which they might gain an advantage over some of their competition. I mean, the banks do compete for clients. There's no question they compete for clients. I mean, I sat here for about 30 seconds and came up with a couple of buzz terms. I'm sure everybody's heard them. Banking can be this comfortable. You're richer than you think. Putting you first. Save your money. I mean, these guys spend a fortune trying to attract clients. Now, we've heard if I'm a representative of a credit union, I'm loving some of the promotion that we're getting out of this because, I mean, everybody's learning that the way that they compete with the chartered banks is to run with lower fees and to be more welcoming, you know, as far as using other competitors' machines. Isn't this an opportunity? Like, wouldn't the Consumers Association see this as an opportunity for the banks to compete on perhaps a different level?
If indeed the financial institutions or the banks felt that they could attract more customers to themselves rather than to their competition, yes, that's what competition is all about. And we do see that there is quite a great deal of competition in the marketplace. As customers, all of us would always like to pay less than we are paying for just about anything we do or buy, and that is the case here. If indeed somebody wants to lower the charges, then they may attract more customers to them. They are free to do so, and indeed we would encourage them and like to see them do so. We are not saying that they should be forced to do so.
Thank you. As a former retailer, I can tell you that it's very simple to say, here's your cost and here's what you're charging on a direct service or that you may be providing or on a good that you may be selling. But those aren't really the costs that go into providing that good or service because you've got a lot of fixed charges, fixed assets, expenditures that you have to make. So if you were to only look at the profit margin on any specific good, it might seem excessive when in reality you've got other base costs that you've got to cover as well. Do you think it's reasonable to look at the cost of a very specific service and analyze that in correlation to the direct cost without looking at the overhead cost of that service and determining that that may be exorbitant? Do you think that's reasonable?
You're quite right that it, in other organizations, one would never take a look at the cost of only one specific service. You have to look at the overall cost of the operation and determine what is profitable. Indeed, when you're talking about retail, we know that sometimes goods are sold at less than cost for marketing purposes, and at other times they are sold for ridiculously high markups on the hope that it all averages out.
I guess I'd like to put the same question to Nadia. Perhaps you might have an opinion on that.
Thank you very much. It's basically my study showed that you put the ATM surcharge significantly above the marginal cost. So I'm not looking at the level of the marginal cost. But what I'm saying is you use this fee as a marketing tool. So if you look at bank, they spend lots of dollars on advertisement. Instead of spending it on advertisement, they spend it on the ATM machine. So this is a marketing tool for the bank. They say, I have a large network. I provide convenience for you. Switch and be my member. So we're not looking just at the marginal cost. There is many other factors that we're ignoring. And here I have really neutral position. I'm a consumer. I would like not to pay anything, but I'm trying to be fair here.
Thank you. Just one more question. I think the biggest thing that we need to protect people against is the potential for gouging. Would anybody, Mr. Fruitman, would you have a position on what might be considered gouging in this industry? What would be a fair charge, and what would be gouging?
Again, that's very difficult to assess because you'd be taking one product or service out of context and separating it from the others. It may be that there are certain circumstances that require a different look, such as those where a market is not served at all or indeed underserved. But in terms of gouging, it would be anybody's guess what that would be.
Okay, thank you. Nothing further.
Conclude with Monsieur Thibault.
Just a couple of points and then one question. What is the question of fees, the use of fees to attract customers? If I go to a consumer cooperative and I buy products and I'm not a member, I'm going to pay more at the end of the year than somebody who's a member. So I could look at that as a fee. And that fee isn't based on their marginal cost of providing me service. It's a method that's used to encourage me to join their cooperative. And I think we find that to be generally acceptable. So to say that the fees have to be fees instituted for servicing somebody who isn't necessarily your customer has to be at the marginal cost of giving the person that service, I don't know that should apply. I don't know that that's a logical argument to make. Question of gouging is important. That question is whether you're a consumer who doesn't have a choice but to deal with you that you're gouging them, that I think is good. As for Mr. Conacher and pointing out to the U.S. banking system, I think a lot of consumers of the banking system in the U.S. look to Canada for inspiration. The service that we have in Canada, from our banking systems, credit unions, chartered banks, other services, and our electronic transfer capabilities from coast to coast and internationally. I think we're quite well served as opposed to the United States. And many would agree. Now, I want to get to the fees. I've seen, in my personal experience, getting access for $0 per transaction. I've seen paying $1 and $1.50 per transaction. I understand that in restaurants or bars or casinos or late-night activities, that people have paid $2.50 or $3 per transaction. I've never heard of that $6 charge that Madame Washer-Solis points out. Is there an example of people, communities, being forced to use Interact machines or ATM machines without competition at those level of charges? Does that exist in our country? Perhaps ask Mr. O'Connell and Mr. Trigg to.
Personally, I've never seen them myself either. I think you're right, depending on the premises. If you talk to a white label operator, they will say each premises has a different business case for the machine, because some machines you've got 200, 300 transactions per month, but those transactions are valued by those consumers who frequent that premises. So I have not seen that type of fee structure, but again, I can't comment across the boards because Interact neither deploys nor operates ABMs.
If I could just interject for greater clarification, you alluded earlier, or Mr. Trigg, I believe you did, to 3 levels of charges: an interchange fee, which institutions pay; a service charge, which customers pay; a surcharge as well, which customers pay on white label machines. Adding those together to get anywhere near $6, is that what this is about?
No, I don't believe so. And of course, in the exchange, we don't surcharge. So just as a consumer, I can tell you I've never seen that kind of fee. But I think what we need to be careful of, I think the word that was used in the question was forced. And it seems unlikely to me that somebody would be forced to pay the $6 fee. If the only reason the ATM is there is because it can only afford to be there at a $6 fee, then I suppose to that extent you're forced. But if the option was paying $6 or not having a machine to use, maybe that's the question. And it is just straight economics here.
Or taking a cab 25 minutes to a nearby community or some such thing. Yeah.
That may be your only other option if there's no machine there at all. And I'm not suggesting I support $6 fees, because we don't support fees at all in the network.
Sorry, Mr. Point of order, Madam Watson.
Point of order is just so you know that the numbers that I've been citing have come from the government's own agency, the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada, which has the full range of charges for every type of transaction. The $6.15 is the maximum charge that could be possible for a private operator that would involve the regular account fee, the Interact fee, the convenience fee, the total transaction fee, and yes, and that's exactly my point.
Thank you for that. That wasn't a point of order, but it was informative. Mr. Thibault.
Well, again, there's a possibility that could be if everything aligned properly. But Mr. O'Connor, do you have knowledge of people paying above $3 per transaction on a regular basis? Is that a common occurrence? Are those fees out there?
No, on the surcharge fee, no. And I think the relevant point is
is what we're talking about here is the element of forced. As I mentioned, consumers are increasingly voting with their feet, and that's indicative of a competitive market. They are going to cash back. 64% of our customers are using cash back, and they are using Interact Direct Payment to purchase goods directly without using cash at an increasing amount year over year. We processed over 3.6 billion debit transactions, and that's why we have shared cash transactions going from 375 million in 2001 to 285 million last year. Again, that's indicative of a competitive environment monitoring and regulating itself as it should be.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur. For the committee members, before we adjourn, Thursday's meeting will be 11 until 2, continuing the ATM discussion. Next Tuesday, we'll deal with estimates from finance. I thank all our witnesses very much for their patience today with the unusual nature of our incoherent hearings, but we do appreciate your preparation of your reports and your participation very much. We thank you. We're adjourned. Incoherent.